All right. I do have some notes in front of me because I am going to be talking about legislation, and I've tried to keep the slides as simple as possible as part of the feedback from the last forum. So this is just to make sure I don't forget anything that's on there as a prompt for me. So I'm going to talk about the dredge material placement component. So there's a whole lot of aspects with dredging, and I can sit here and talk to you all day about things. I'm not allowed to sit here all day and talk to you about things. So we're just going to be focusing on the placement today. And at the last forum, maintenance dredging seemed to be a much greater focus and concern than the capital component. So all capital dredging is coming to land, so it's going into that reclamation. So my presentation is going to focus on on the maintenance component. But if you do have questions at the end on the capital, we can certainly try and do those as well. So I'm going to run through the legislative process that's to do with maintenance dredging approval, the placement components and how that works, in addition to the EIS, so this is a separate aspect. And maintenance dredging is going to cover what essentially currently happens, as well as what's going to happen with future future maintenance dredging as well.
Excuse me, Melinda, just before we start.
Yes.
Your sentence construction always says what is going to happen. It hasn't been approved. Can you just change your sentences so that if approved, this is what would happen? You know what I mean? There is an assumption all the way through that approval is going to happen.
Yep, that's fine. Maintenance dredging is going to happen. So maintenance dredging occurs. It's also, this will manage the increase if that's approved.
Yes.
Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. So last time we touched on some of the physical attributes, so the particle size components, acid sulfate soil, and those components. But it's not only those that are considered in it, it's also the environmental aspects of it and the social components. I'm also going to run through some of the options that we've looked at previously for maintenance dredging, and then also open up pretty much about some of the future options. So, moving on. So legislative process. There is a whole raft of legislation that covers both the dredging aspect, so the actual activity of dredging, and then also the placement component. So I guess starting at the top, there's an international convention that Australia is a signatory to, which is the London Convention, which is about placement of material at sea as one of the factors in that. So basically, that protocol requires other alternatives to be considered, other than, other than sea dumping. That includes land-based disposal, recycling, treatment of material in a way that doesn't pose a risk to human health or the environment, or include disproportionate costs. So there is a component in that, and that's essentially overseen by the International Maritime Organisation, so the IMO. Oops, moving on. So the Environmental Protection Sea Dumping Act. So this is the main piece of legislation of how Australia meets the requirements of that London Protocol. And again, it reflects some of those components, or it reflects those aspects within it. And it's about minimising pollution from the placement and prohibits ocean disposal of waste considered harmful, and regulating the placement of any material. So that act applies to vessels, it applies to aircraft, it applies to if you're going to scuttle a dive wreck. This act applies in the Commonwealth space. Alrighty. So the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Act. Oops, I skipped a really important one. The Environmental Protection, Biodiversity and Conservation Act. So this act aims to balance the protection of crucial environmental and cultural values with the social, economic, social needs. So if there's a significant impact on values, this is where that act comes in. Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Act, obviously if anything's in the marine park, that's regulated through that act, and with a rigorous assessment process under that. Now there's a whole range of guidelines, so it's great to have this legislation, but how do they make sure that they're assessing things in a very similar way? So we have a national assessment, we call it NAGD, it's NAGD, which outlines how you sample, the numbers of samples, how those locations of those are sampled. So it's got, if you're doing a certain volume, you use random tables to get it, and it's got a robust process behind it, which I'll go through in a little bit. And there's also guidelines in various other areas. So, for example, there's the hydrodynamic numerical modelling that Gabrumpa has. Again, it's showing these are the things your model has to do, and it gives clarity, I guess, on both sides so that we know exactly what we have to do and how that's presented. And the assessment agency knows what they're going to be seeing, and that if they're seeing this from one project, that they're comparable. There's a whole range of more guidelines and things like that, but they're sort of the crucial ones that we operate within. Then we get on to the state process. So the Transport Infrastructure Act is the act that we are a port authority under, and it actually mandates legally that we have to maintain our assets and infrastructure for navigation safety. Coastal Protection and Management Act is about the protection of coastal processes, coastal material and resources, and is aligned with the protection, conservation and rehabilitation of Queensland's coastal zone. The Environmental Protection Act is the key piece of Queensland legislation, and this one picks up the dredging activity as well. And it picks up the protection of Queensland's environment through an integrated management program that's consistent with ecologically sustainable development. Fisheries Act, so this is if there's marine plants impacted, if there's seagrass, if there's algae, the Fisheries Act comes in at that point. Marine Park Act, so obviously you have federal marine parks as well as state marine parks. They're managed essentially concurrently, but the different acts power the different components. Sustainable Ports Development Act, so this is the one that came in 2015. That mandates master planning for priority ports. So Townsville is a priority port. And also this is the act that prohibited capital placement in the coastal Great Barrier Reef World Heritage areas. So for the federal component, that came in under the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park regulations, and then this is the sister act, essentially, for the state for that component. The Planning Act, that's essentially the overarching framework that a lot of those other acts fit within. So the Planning Act is essentially the affiliation one. And then the Maintenance Dredging Strategy, so that's a Department of Main Roads. So our minister is the Department Transport Minister. So this is a strategy, and we are signed to it, but it's not technically an act. So that's a requirement for all of us to align with and meet. Okay. Sorry about the legislation heavy component. I just wanted people to understand there's a whole raft of oversight in that area. So this looks really easy and really quick. I'm going to spend a fair bit of time on this slide because there is so many components within it. And technically I should have actually put it up as a loop because you sort of get through, and a lot of the information from a previous one will then feed back into any next application. Yes, I will. I sort of had a debate and I went, no, we'll just go vertically first. So sediment testing, it's kind of a chicken and egg in a component. You need to know the quality of the sediment or the material that you're talking about before you can then work out what some of your options are going to be. So in general, it's guided by the National Assessment Disposal Guidelines. If it's coming to land, there is a slightly other component, but at least doing this testing initially, then you change it for land. I'll go through that in a little bit of detail as well. So what happens first of all is you do a sampling analysis plan. So you develop up where you're going to sample, so what volume you're going to be dredging, therefore what sampling regime you need. So do you need 11 samples, do you need 77 samples, do you need whatever. Then that's randomly generated, so those go in different various dredge areas. And then you also put in what contaminants you're going to be testing against. So that changes by region. So a tropical port might be very different to a port in Melbourne. So the guidelines are a national guideline, so some things that are in there may or may not be relevant, and some things may be very relevant for us. So that all gets put in a plan. That plan then gets submitted to the regulators. So depending on where you are, so for us it goes to state and federal. So it goes to Department of Environment and Heritage in the state, and it goes to the Department of Environment and Energy in the feds. They then review that sampling analysis plan and say, there is a change needed, you need more samples, you haven't thought about this parameter, so is there something that needs to be changed? So then that comes back as an approved sampling analysis plan. So yes, you can sample in those locations. Excuse me for 2 seconds. Love microphones. And so then that comes back as an approved plan. Then you go out and sample in accordance with that plan. And then a sampling implementation report is done up. So that's a report that says that you sampled in those locations. Here's the results, here's the QA/QC, here's all the laboratory backing components of it. And then that again goes back to those regulators. So if they're happy with that, and then that assesses that material versus that criteria. So it can be either deemed suitable for unconfined sea disposal. In Melbourne, for example, with the big channel dredging they had down there, it was defined as suitable for ocean disposal, but it had to be capped. So they dug a hole, put the material in, and covered it back over. So there's a whole range of components that can be assessed under it, but for us it's either unconfined ocean disposal or not, pretty much. If it's not suitable for unconfined ocean disposal, that doesn't mean it's contaminated on land. So in general, they're highly precautious about what goes to sea, because once it's there, you can't get it back. It's gone. And I guess for us, the result of this is also fed back through our Technical Advisory Consultative Committee. So we have one of those for our maintenance dredging, as well as we're proposing one for the port expansion if that gets approved. Then we get to the point that we can start the application process. So you know the quality of material you're talking about, you know the physical attributes of it, you know the chemical constituents of it, and then you can look at what options you've got. So for the application, there's structured guidelines. Unfortunately for us, there's 3 sets of structured guidelines. So there's the federal structured guidelines, there's the state structured guidelines, and now there's Department of Main Roads structured guidelines as well. So our application has to meet all those 3 processes. And in that, we need to assess all the disposal options. So from land, the different options that are available. And I'll get through how those assessments come a little bit later as well. It includes impact assessment and it includes risk assessments. So, and they're not just done by us. They're either done in consultation with regulators, with our TAC, and sometimes there's a whole lot of information behind them, and other times things are thrown out at the top level. So you might have things in there that are just never going to get up, so they're looked at but they're dismissed by the group as a sort of early risk component. Research monitoring programs and results. So it feeds in any of the results from the monitoring that you'd been doing previously if you have had a previous placement application. But it also highlights what research and monitoring you'll be doing in the next period of that placement as well. And then this all comes into essentially a long-term dredge management plan, which puts all of that together in addition to the application. So sometimes there's duplications between the application and the long-term dredge management plan. Sometimes there's a commitment. Assessment, so then that all goes off to the regulators. Depending on the regulator, they have different time periods. So the federal period is a 90-day assessment, and they can ask for additional information if there's something missing or if they need more information. So then it's either permitted with conditions. You can get a permit with no conditions. I don't think I've ever seen one ever, or else it can be declined. So with those conditions, if it's permitted, there will normally be things like our research and monitoring commitments, an oversight panel, so a requirement of an oversight panel, a technical advisory committee in our case, and then also a commitment to that long-term dredge management plan being applied and also being reviewed. Look, just also noting there too that the NAGD states that if a viable option to sea disposal exists, the permit is unlikely to be granted. And then compliance and reporting, so implementation of conditions, so how do you comply with those, complying with those. They're internally and externally audited, so that's either by the regulator, by ourselves or by a third party for us. The Technical Advisory Consultative Committee has an oversight on those components, so they get a report to what our condition compliance has been annually. There's an annual EMP, so whilst there's a long-term dredge management plan for an operational EMP, that environmental management plan, that's not that useful. So often it will be the components that are useful for the on-ground component will be pulled into an environmental management plan, and that's renewed annually. Testing to confirm that there's no change in sediment quality. So it's great to do a sampling 5 years at the beginning, but making sure that nothing has changed in that 5 years. If you get a 5-year approval, for example, how do you make sure that nothing has changed? Research and development. So we actually have a section 19 with Environment Protection, Department of Environment and Energy in Canberra, as to what monitoring we will be doing going into the future, and we report back to them on that. Our other monitoring, so we do a whole range of monitoring in association with that may or may not be legislated. We report volumes annually to EHP, Department of Environment and Energy, DTMR, and that also goes to the International Maritime Organisation. Sorry, DTMR is Department of Transport Main Roads. I'm trying with my acronyms, really trying. And then you get to that, and all of that component feeds back in. So you never start again. If you have information, if you have knowledge, then it feeds in. It's not reinventing the same knowledge, it's making sure that you're continually improving knowledge and moving forward as well. So that's not a fast process. There's a lot of work that goes into those, so it's awesome when you see it on the slide like that. And I'm looking at that going, that's at least 18 months or more in that process. So I'll run through some of the options. It jumps around a little bit, I'm sorry. So land placement. Land placement has absolutely been considered throughout the history of the port. The vast majority of the port is actually reclaimed from dredge material over time. So from about the early 80s, we've had the Eastern Reclamation, which is this area. Unfortunately, that's now extremely full. There's been the Townsville Marine Precinct stages 1, 2 and 3, and there's still a component in there. Some legal challenges in that space. The Townsville State Development Area, so that's down here. One of the challenges we've had is everyone who's not a local or not necessarily knows Townsville as an area goes, oh, there's this awesome land down here, and it's like, yes, but that has environmental values too. So it's not just a giant empty block that we can do things on. And at the moment, that's actually under private ownership, so getting access to that, but we have looked at it. Inland, so can we move the material? There's mines, there's other components, can it go backfill? So again, this is where some of that salinity is actually a challenge for that versus anything that's actually in the material, and you still need the space to dewater. Van Tassel Street landfill component. Council can take a small component of it. They don't want it and they can't manage the quantities that we generate. But when we do have components that come to shore, and if a port operator does want to take it off, they can take small components. Not an option for the large volumes we normally talk about. Beach renourishment. So can we use it for beach renourishment? I guess flagging in there as well, there is different areas we dredge. So we also dredge Ross River. That all does come to land. So that is sands, but also because it's a cutter, it all comes to land because you would have floating pipelines and a whole range of other things component. Sand bypass, so again, it's mainly been around this area. Can we just take it and essentially keep it in the system but push it back around? So some of those key challenges are the land available for land placement, so you need to dewater it to be able to manage it, and the engineering properties and the material in general. That doesn't mean we don't ever continue to revisit those. You can only make the assessment on what's available at the time. Technology changes, land ownership changes, cost profile changes. So what might not have been viable 5 years ago might now actually be cost achievable because things change. Sometimes things, if you're in a peak of a mining boom, might not be cost effective because trying to get people or trucks is just a nightmare. Might be a bit different even with a slightly different change. So just reminding everyone what material we're talking about. So beach nourishment sounds awesome. Some of it's just not an option for our material. Engineeringly, it's not great because it's plasticity. So it gets wet, it expands, gets dry, it cracks as well. Sea placement, so where have we looked? What? And don't worry, it's not that we're moving places. So historically, our inshore displacement area, so this is probably in the last 20 to 25 years, the areas. So no, I'm not going to walk away from the microphone, sorry, I'm a poker. So this was the inshore disposal area in the late 1990s. That was the last time it was used, about 1990. Then we moved to the offshore disposal area. So these were actually in operation at the same time, but then this one became the placement area. In 1992-93, with the capital dredging that went with Maggie Island, everyone had a really good look at this placement ground, and the optimised current placement ground was chosen. So it was chosen to push it past the about 10 to 11 metre contour, so keep it in as deep a water as possible for resuspension, and the trapezoid, the shape came from that. In the EIS, not the AEIS, so the AEIS, everything came to shore. These two areas were looked at, and in fact that picture from those muds came from those two locations. So that's not from in here. And they've got benefits of that. So there is some of the key challenges, there's a range of sensitive habitats. Resuspension, so what's going to happen to that material? Benthic type, so is there seagrasses there, is there no seagrasses there? Commercial and recreational vessel movements, and then also operational requirements. So currently it takes about 2 hours to get from the dredge area to the dredge placement area and back. If you add half an hour to that, it means the impact shift in that changes it from about a 33-day dredge campaign to a 46-day dredge campaign without any change in volume, just because of the additional time. This is just a quick photo showing some of those. So this is the offshore disposal, which was the sort of towards Cape Cleveland. This is the offshore placement area we looked at, which is sort of behind Maggie Island. And this is the existing DMPA, so the existing placement area. So this is not, it's almost a horrendogram. So this is 3 months of commercial traffic. It's in the AEIS. Each of the different colours is a different month, and it's commercial vessels. So it does pick up your ferries as well as your trawlers, as well as our ships as well. So you can see this one here, the black one is probably a trawler. Now that doesn't mean that you can't put things there, but this area here, for example, you wouldn't be looking at putting a placement area there. They can move around placement areas, but it's one of the things we have to factor in. So duration, so how long does a permit last? That changes depending on which approval it is. So on a federal level, they can approve up to a 10-year. In general, they'll go 3 to 5, and since 2012, we've been getting 1-year approval processes. So that means we've essentially been in a perpetual state of application and assessment. Dredge allocation, so that's the land placement and sea placement for the state. That can be up to a 6-year approval. ERA 16, so that's the environmental relevant activity of dredging, has got a ongoing approval. However, they can change conditions in that. And the sediment testing data, so if you go out and test, that's got a 5-year life. So how do you compare this? These are just randomly made up as an indication. One of the challenges, how do you communicate something that's a very complex component? So for land disposal, resuspension might not be an issue. For sea disposal, it's absolutely an issue. For land placement, remnant vegetation might be a massive, or a salt marsh vegetation. For your sea component, it's not. So you end up with assessments essentially kind of that look like this. And if it's central, so if it's quite close to the centre, that's meaning that it's got the less outcomes. What you'll often see is, in general, you might have a good option, but there may be an impact out the side, or there may be an area that it's still not performing as well as all of them. So often they'll use the area within that to indicate what's the best outcome. So that they're just the general things. So where to from here with maintenance dredging? So regardless of PEP, so PEP's a component of that, or potentially a component of that. So we continue to look at opportunities to minimise dredging. We are always looking for opportunities to minimise dredging. We don't want to be dredging. It's got a whole range of impacts for us. If I could say to Renee tomorrow, we get to stop maintenance dredging, I think I'd make her a very happy person. It's been one of the biggest challenges for the port in our history, and continues to be. So we're looking to utilise the existing DMPA for the next 5 years, because looking at all of those options in the level of detail required just takes time. Not that we aren't revisiting those, but for absolute full component, I'm wrapping up. But we are also looking at pushing it to the deeper areas of that DMPA to minimise resuspension. And then identify and work through. So there's a number of areas that we've had in there that we've thrown out at that high level component. So placing a mud island or an island, for example, around near Cape Cleveland, dugong protection area, high seagrass beds, it's just been thrown out on those grounds. So, but going back and revisiting those components. Work with regulators to identify and close any data gaps. So there is sometimes data gaps. You don't want to be throwing out options just because there's a hole in information. But essentially, to look at a number of those components, you're essentially looking at an EIS or an environmental impact assessment statement, particularly for those marine park components. Actually, any water component, really. And then doing that for the next 5 years. So within the next 3 years, having all of those bedded down, having all those assessments so that we're ready to go. So this is where I was actually going to throw it open, in that we can look at mud islands or building a structure for the placement of material wherever it is. As I said, that had been removed as a high level component, but we're happy to do it. And I guess some of it has been that it hasn't been open and transparent. So that's where we want to make sure that everyone's across what the thought process is on the way through.
Okay, quick show of hands as to who might like to ask a question.